April 14th, 1945. The morning air tasted like ash and diesel fuel. Private James Hartwell pressed his back against the cold stone wall of a bombed-out bakery, feeling the grit of pulverized brick dig into his shoulders through his wool uniform. His hands trembled not from fear, though God knew there was plenty of that, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that came from sleeping in foxholes for 3 weeks straight. The kind of tiredness that made your teeth ache. Kronach sat before them like something out of a medieval storybook that someone had set on fire and tried to put out with artillery shells. The fortress town perched on its hilltop, all dark stone and narrow streets, crowned by the Rosenberg fortress that had watched over this corner of Bavaria for 500 years. Now it watched American soldiers creep through its outskirts like cautious predators circling wounded prey. Jimmy wiped his palm across his face, feeling the stubble that had grown thick and uneven. 22 years old, and he felt ancient. Back home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, his mother would be getting ready for church. She'd light a candle for him, like she did every Sunday. He wondered if she'd kept his room the same, if his kid sister still snuck in there to read his old comic books. Hartwell. Sergeant McKinnon's voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you with us? Or are you taking a vacation?" "Here, Sarge." Jimmy straightened, adjusting the Monet rifle slung across his chest. The weight of it had become as familiar as his own arm. McKinnon crouched beside him, his face a road map of dirt and worry lines. The sergeant was maybe 35 but looked 50. War did that. It aged you in dog years. Intel says the Germans are pulling out. Most of them anyway. But there's still SS holdouts in the fortress. Command wants us to sweep the residential areas, secure civilians, and look for stragglers. Jimmy nodded. He'd heard variations of this order 100 times since. Crossing the Rhine. Every town was the same story: Wehrmacht retreating, fanatics digging in, civilians caught in the middle like wheat between millstones. Thompson's squad takes the east side. We go north through the market district. McKinnon's eyes scanned the narrow street ahead, calculating angles, cover points, kill zones. Watch the windows, watch the cellars, and for Christ's sake, watch each other. Before we continue with this story, if you're finding yourself drawn into Jimmy's world, hit that subscribe button. These forgotten moments of World War II deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us uncover more. The squad moved forward in a staggered line, boots scraping against cobblestones that had been laid down when America was still a British colony. Jimmy kept his rifle raised, scanning windows that gaped like empty eye sockets. Most of the glass had been blown out. Curtains fluttered in the April breeze like ghosts waving goodbye. The silence pressed down on them, heavy and unnatural. No birds sang, no dogs barked, just the distant rumble of artillery to the south and the rasp of their own breathing. They passed a fountain in a small square, its stone basin cracked and filled with debris instead of water. A German helmet sat on the edge, abandoned or placed there as some kind of marker. Jimmy's finger tightened on the trigger guard as they moved past. "Smell that?" Private Rodriguez whispered from behind him. Jimmy inhaled. Beneath the omnipresent stench of cordite and dust, there was something else. Bread. Someone was baking bread. The absurdity of it, this normal, peacetime smell in the middle of a war zone, made his stomach clench with sudden, fierce hunger. They'd been living on K-rations and whatever they could scrounge for weeks. McKinnon raised his fist. The squad froze. From around the corner ahead, Jimmy heard voices. German voices. His pulse hammered in his ears. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong. Not the sharp bark of military commands. Softer. Almost. Conversational? McKinnon signaled forward. They crept to the corner, weapons ready. What Jimmy saw made no sense at first. His brain refused to process it. In the middle of the street, maybe 30 yards away, stood a cluster of maybe 40 people. Civilians, old men in worn coats, women in headscarves, children clinging to their mothers' skirts. And among them, distributed through the crowd like shepherds with their flock, were German soldiers, Wehrmacht by their uniforms, maybe a dozen of them. But nobody was pointing guns, nobody was shouting orders. The Germans were handing out something. Small packages wrapped in paper. The civilians took them with both hands, some nodding, some saying quiet words of thanks that carried on the morning air. "What in the hell?" Rodriguez breathed. One of the German soldiers, an older man with sergeant stripes and a face carved from leather, looked up and locked eyes with Jimmy. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. The German's hand rested on his holstered pistol, but he didn't draw. Jimmy's rifle was already raised, but his finger stayed outside the trigger guard. The moment stretched like taffy, pulling thinner and thinner. Then the German sergeant did something that would echo in Jimmy's memory for the rest of his life. He smiled. Not a mean smile, not mocking, just tired, resigned. He raised his other hand slowly, palm out, and spoke in heavily accented English. "American soldiers, we are not fighting today." McKinnon moved forward, rifle still at the ready but angled down slightly. Jimmy and the rest of the squad fanned out, covering approaches, eyes darting to windows and doorways. But the German soldiers just stood there, hands visible, weapons holstered or slung over shoulders. "I am Feldwebel Ernst Richter," the German sergeant said. His voice was rough, like gravel tumbling in a can. "These are my men. We are, how do you say, finished with war. That right?" McKinnon's voice was flat, giving nothing away. "Then drop your weapons and put your hands up. You're prisoners of war." Richter translated quickly to his men in rapid German. They exchanged glances. A few looked at the civilians clustered around them. An old woman, with a face like crumpled paper, clutched one of the paper packages to her chest and said something sharp in German that Jimmy didn't catch. "We will surrender," Richter said slowly. "But first, we must finish the distribution. For the children. This is important." "Distribution of what?" McKinnon demanded. Richter held up one of the packages. Even from 20 feet away, Jimmy could see it was wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Chocolate. "From the fortress stores. The SS fled yesterday, took vehicles, fuel, and ammunition, left food behind. We are giving it to civilians before we go." Jimmy felt Rodriguez shift beside him. "Sarge, this is—" "Shut it." McKinnon never took his eyes off Richter. The sergeant was calculating, weighing options. Taking prisoners was straightforward. Taking prisoners who insisted on finishing their humanitarian chocolate distribution first? That wasn't in any field manual. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, tugged on Richter's coat sleeve. She looked up at him with huge, dark eyes in a too-thin face. Richter crouched down, smiled, and pressed a package into her hands. She clutched it, like it was made of gold, and darted back to her mother. Jimmy lowered his rifle slightly. He couldn't help it. "How much longer?" McKinnon asked, his voice rough with something that might have been grudging respect. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. Richter gestured to a wooden crate sitting on the ground nearby. It was half full of wrapped packages. "This is the last box. Then we surrender properly." McKinnon looked at his men. Jimmy saw the same confusion on every face that he felt churning in his own chest. The war had taught them clear categories: enemies and allies, combat and surrender, shooting and not shooting. This existed in some gray space between everything they'd been trained for. "Thompson," McKinnon called over his shoulder to the corporal covering their rear. "Get on the radio. Tell command we've got a dozen Wehrmacht in Sector 7 Charlie, civilian population present, situation under control but unusual." "Unusual how, Sarge?" "Just say something unusual. They'll love that." While they waited for the radio response, an uneasy peace settled over the street. The German soldiers continued handing out chocolate. The civilians, initially frozen in fear when the Americans appeared, slowly resumed their quiet queuing. An old man with one arm missing thanked a young German private who couldn't have been more than 17. The private's eyes were red-rimmed, hollowed out by something more than just lack of sleep. Jimmy found himself drifting closer, curiosity overriding caution. One of the German soldiers, a corporal with wire-rimmed glasses held together with tape, noticed him approaching. The German tensed, but didn't reach for his weapon. "You speak English?" Jimmy asked. The corporal nodded slowly. "Some. I studied before the war, in university." "What's the story here? Why give away the chocolate?" The corporal adjusted his glasses. His hands shook slightly. "The children here, they have nothing. 2 years of bombing, of shortages. He paused, searching for words. "We are soldiers, we follow orders, but we are also men. When the SS left, Feldwebel Richter said we could leave too, retreat east. Or we stay and make sure supplies go to people who need, not burn in fires or taken by," he waved vaguely, "by anyone who comes after. So you stayed to play Santa Claus?" The corporal's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "Santa Claus in April? Yes. Maybe this is all we can do now. One good thing before." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Before prison camps, before going home to a Germany that would be carved up, like a Christmas turkey, before facing whatever came next, in a world where they'd been on the losing side. Rodriguez appeared at Jimmy's shoulder. "Command says to secure them and the civilians. They're sending trucks for transport." "What about the chocolate?" Rodriguez shrugged. "Didn't ask. Guess that's up to Sarge." McKinnon had been watching Richter organize the distribution with the efficiency of a man who'd probably been a shopkeeper or manager in his previous life. When the last package was pressed into the last pair of small hands, Richter straightened, adjusted his uniform, and walked toward McKinnon with his hands raised. "It is finished," he said simply. "We are your prisoners now." The German soldiers laid down their weapons in a neat row on the cobblestones, rifles, pistols, a few stick grenades. The metallic clatter echoed off the stone buildings like falling coins. Jimmy watched Richter unbuckle his belt and place his Luger on top of the pile with something that looked like reverence, or maybe relief. McKinnon assigned Rodriguez and Thompson to guard the prisoners while he conferred with the lieutenant who'd arrived with the transport trucks. Jimmy stood at a distance, cradling his rifle, watching the civilians disperse back toward their homes, clutching their packages of chocolate. The little girl who'd tugged on Richter's sleeve was being led away by her mother, a woman who couldn't have been older than 30 but looked twice that. The girl had already torn open her package and was nibbling at a square of chocolate, her eyes closed in something approaching bliss. When was the last time she'd tasted anything sweet? Months? Years? Hell of a thing, ain't it? Jimmy turned. Private First Class Marcus Washington stood beside him, his dark face streaked with dirt and sweat. Marcus was from Birmingham, Alabama, had been a school teacher before the war. He read more books than anyone Jimmy had ever met, and had a way of cutting through bullshit with a single observation. "What's that?" Jimmy asked. "Watching the enemy feed hungry kids." Marcus tilted his head toward where Richter and his men stood in a loose group, hands clasped behind their heads, waiting for whatever came next. "My grandma used to say you can measure a man not by what he does when people are watching, but by what he does when he thinks nobody's gonna find out." These Krauts knew they could slip away. Nobody would have known about the chocolate, could have taken it with them, traded it for favors or safe passage. But they stayed. "They're still Nazis," Jimmy said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Wehrmacht, not SS. Maybe that matters. Maybe it doesn't." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "My little cousin, Alma, she's about the age of that girl there, 7 years old. Loves butterscotch candies. When I think about some soldier, any soldier, seeing her hungry and scared, I'd want to believe he'd do the decent thing. Even if he wore the wrong uniform." Jimmy didn't have a response to that. The moral certainties that had seemed so solid back in basic training, back when they'd watched newsreels of concentration camps and bombed-out cities, had developed cracks. The war wasn't black and white anymore. It was 1,000 shades of gray, and every day brought new ones. The lieutenant finished his conversation with McKinnon and approached the German prisoners. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of pressed uniform that meant he'd been behind the lines until recently. He looked at the prisoners with the mixture of disgust and uncertainty that came with not knowing what to do with enemies who'd already surrendered before you showed up. "Sergeant," The lieutenant called to Richter. "You're the ranking man here?" "Ja. Yes." Richter stepped forward. "What's your unit?" "7th Infantry Regiment, 272nd Volksgrenadier Division." The lieutenant pulled out a small notebook, scribbling details. "How many SS are still in the fortress?" Richter's jaw tightened. "Maybe 20. Fanatics. They will fight to the death. They shot 2 of my men yesterday for suggesting surrender." "Jesus." The lieutenant looked up at the fortress looming above them. "Anyone else? Commanders? Officers?" "All gone. They left 2 days ago. Cars, motorcycles, rats from a sinking ship." There was venom in Richter's voice now, the first real emotion Jimmy had heard from him. "They leave us to die for their—" He spat a German word that needed no translation. "Well, you're not dying today," the lieutenant said. "You'll be processed as POWs, transported to a camp, probably in France first, then maybe England or the States. Could be worse." "Could be," Richter agreed quietly. The trucks arrived, canvas-covered deuce-and-a-halfs that had carried ammunition and supplies forward and would now carry prisoners back. McKinnon organized the loading, keeping his squad on alert. Jimmy noticed that none of the German soldiers tried to run. They climbed into the trucks methodically, sitting on the benches with the exhausted compliance of men who'd finally set down a heavy burden. Before Richter climbed aboard, he turned back toward the street, where they'd distributed the chocolate. The civilians had mostly vanished, retreated into homes and cellars to wait out whatever came next. But the old one-armed man stood in a doorway, watching. When he caught Richter's eye, he raised his remaining hand in a small salute. Richter returned it. Then he climbed into the truck. The lieutenant turned to McKinnon. "Secure this sector and move up to the market square. We're going to set up a temporary command post before we assault the fortress." "Yes, sir." As the trucks rumbled away, belching diesel smoke, Jimmy realized he'd been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, feeling something tight in his chest loosen fractionally. "All right, ladies," McKinnon barked. "War's not over just 'cause we found some krauts with a conscience. Let's move." They advanced through Kronach street by street, clearing buildings, checking basements. They found more civilians' families huddled in root cellars, old men too stubborn or too scared to leave their homes, a priest tending to wounded in the basement of a church. Each time, they directed people toward the American lines, toward relative safety. In a bakery, maybe the same one that had been producing that impossible smell of fresh bread earlier, they found the baker still working his ovens. He was maybe 60, with flour dusted in his thinning hair and burns on his forearms from decades of handling hot pans. "Warum backen Sie?" McKinnon asked, using one of the few German phrases he'd picked up. "Why are you baking?" The baker looked at him like he'd asked why the sun rose in the morning. "Because people must eat," he said in broken English. "War or no war, people must eat." He pulled a loaf from the oven, golden brown and steaming. Without asking permission, he tore it in half and handed one portion to McKinnon, the other to Jimmy. The heat seared Jimmy's palms through his gloves, but the smell, the smell made his mouth flood with saliva. They ate standing there in the bakery, while the German baker prepared another batch of dough. Nobody spoke. There wasn't anything to say. Outside, artillery rumbled. Inside, bread is baked. The world contained both things at once, and somehow that made sense. By late afternoon, the Rosenberg fortress had become a problem that needed solving. Jimmy's squad was ordered to establish a perimeter on the northern approach, while artillery pounded the medieval walls. Each impact sent stone dust and fragments cascading down the hillside like snow. The fortress had withstood sieges during the 30 Years' War, but American high-explosive shells were doing what Swedish cannons couldn't. They took cover in a stone stable that had once housed horses and now housed only ghosts. Jimmy pressed his back against the wall, feeling each artillery strike through the stone, a physical presence in his chest. "Think they'll surrender?" Rodriguez asked, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day. "Nervous habit?" Marcus shook his head. "SS? They'll fight till they run out of bullets or bodies. Probably both." "Such a waste," McKinnon muttered. He was crouched by a window, binoculars trained on the fortress. War's over. Everyone knows it. But some men would rather burn than admit they lost. Jimmy thought about Richter and his men, about their choice to stay and distribute chocolate instead of running. He thought about the baker still baking bread, about the one-armed man's salute. These were all choices made in the face of overwhelming futility, small assertions of humanity in the midst of machinery designed to destroy it. "Incoming!" someone shouted. They hit the ground as return fire from the fortress stitched across the stable wall, punching fist-sized holes in the stone. Dust rained down. Jimmy tasted grit and copper had he bitten his tongue. The firefight was brief but intense. American artillery found its range and began systematically dismantling the fortress walls. Machine gun nests that had stood for 500 years were obliterated in seconds. Jimmy fired at muzzle flashes in the fortress windows, not knowing if he hit anything, not really wanting to know. Then, as suddenly as it started, the firing from the fortress stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the void. Jimmy's ears rang like church bells. "Cease fire!" The order came down the line. "Cease fire!" Slowly, cautiously, they lifted their heads. White flags appeared in the fortress windows, bedsheets, tablecloths, anything that could signal surrender. "About damn time," Rodriguez breathed. They advanced up the hill in a careful formation, weapons ready for treachery. But when they reached the fortress gates, they found only broken men. 15 SS soldiers, half wounded, all defeated. Their officer, a captain with a bandaged head and eyes that had seen too much, handed over his pistol to McKinnon with shaking hands. "It is finished," he said in perfect English. Then again, softer. "It is finished." The Americans secured the fortress, collected weapons, and separated the wounded from the whole. Medics moved through, treating German and American casualties with the same brisk efficiency. In the war's aftermath, blood was just blood, pain just pain. Jimmy found himself in what had been the fortress's kitchen. The large hearth was cold, but the larder had been ransacked. He noticed something odd on one of the shelves' chocolate wrappers, dozens of them. This is where Richter had gotten the supplies for his distribution. A sound made him turn. An SS private, couldn't have been more than 19, sat in the corner with his hands zip-tied. He was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "You okay?" Jimmy asked, then felt stupid. The kid was a prisoner of war, wounded, his country destroyed, his cause lost. Of course he wasn't okay. The young soldier looked up. "My brother," he said in halting English. "He was in Richter's company. Did you see? The Wehrmacht guys handing out chocolate to the kids?" The soldier nodded eagerly. Hans Richter, that is my brother." He is alive?" Jimmy thought about lying, about the easier paths of silence. But he remembered the one-armed man's salute. Small mercies in the face of great darkness. "Yeah," Jimmy said. "He's alive. He surrendered peacefully. He's probably in a truck heading west by now. He'll be okay." The relief that washed over the young soldier's face was so profound it hurt to witness. He sagged against the wall, whispering what sounded like a prayer of thanks. Jimmy left him there and walked out into the fortress courtyard. The sun was setting, painting the medieval stones gold and amber. American flags were being raised. German prisoners were being formed into columns for transport. Wounded were being carried to aid stations. The ancient machinery of conquest and occupation ground forward, unstoppable as tide. But in the street below, a little girl was eating chocolate, and a baker was still baking bread. And a German sergeant who could have run had chosen to stay and do one good thing before the darkness claimed everything. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. 3 weeks later, Jimmy Hartwell sat in a cafe in Nuremberg, drinking real coffee, actual coffee, not the chicory or burnt sawdust they'd been choking down for months, and reading a letter from home. His sister had written about spring in Iowa, about the apple blossoms and the neighbor's new puppy, and how she'd gotten an A on her history paper about the Revolutionary War. Normal things. impossibly distant things. The war in Europe was over. It had been for 12 days. Victory in Europe Day, they called it, VE Day. There had been celebrations, drinking, kissing strangers in the street. Jimmy had spent it in a supply depot, inventorying boots. Seemed fitting somehow. Marcus sat across from him, reading a newspaper. The headlines screamed about the camps they'd discovered. Dachau, Buchenwald, names that would become synonymous with humanity's capacity for evil. The photos were worse than anything Jimmy had imagined, and he'd imagined a lot. Makes you wonder, Marcus said without looking up, about those Wehrmacht soldiers. About whether giving out chocolate absolves anything. I don't think it was about absolution, Jimmy said slowly, surprising himself. He'd been thinking about this a lot in the quiet hours. I think it was about, I don't know, remembering they were human maybe. One last time before they became just prisoners, just numbers, just the enemy. You think they knew? About the camps? Some of them must have. Not all. Maybe not Richter and his men. Jimmy folded his sister's letter carefully, creasing the edges with precision. Does it matter? They still wore the uniform. They still fought for that flag. Yeah. Marcus set down the newspaper. But they also stayed behind to feed hungry kids. People are complicated. War makes us want simple answers, good guys and bad guys, but people are just complicated. Through the cafe window, Jimmy watched German civilians moving through the rubble-strewn streets, old women carrying bags of what little food they could scrounge, children playing in the ruins of buildings that had stood for centuries, a man with one leg navigating the broken cobblestones with a crutch made from a rifle stock. Somewhere in an Allied POW camp, Feldwebel Ernst Richter was probably sitting on a cot, maybe writing a letter to his own family, wondering about the little girl who'd tugged on his coat sleeve, wondering if she'd savored that chocolate or devoured it in seconds, wondering if she'd remember him at all, or if he'd just be one more fading memory in a childhood full of horrors. Jimmy would never see Richter again, never know if he made it home, if he rebuilt his life, if he told his grandchildren about the war. But he knew this. On April 14, 1945, in a fortress town called Kronach, a German sergeant and his men had chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier, had chosen to stay when fleeing would have been safer, had given away chocolate to enemy children because it was a decent thing to do. It was such a small thing in the grand calculus of war, a few dozen bars of chocolate distributed to hungry civilians. It didn't tip the balance of the conflict. It didn't shorten the war by a single day. It didn't save lives or change history. But for one little girl with dark eyes and a too thin face, for one moment on one morning in one war-torn town, the world had been kind. And in the end, Jimmy thought as he finished his coffee and prepared to rejoin his unit for the long occupation ahead, maybe that was the only victory that ever really mattered. Not the big conquests, not the flags raised or treaties signed, but the small moments when people chose mercy over hate, when they remembered their humanity even when everything around them had gone mad. The chocolate in Kronach wouldn't make it into the history books. There'd be no monuments erected, no medals awarded. Richter and his men would be recorded, if at all, as simple POWs, their names on a roster somewhere in some forgotten archive. But Jimmy would remember, Marcus would remember, the baker would remember, the one-armed man would remember. And somewhere, a little girl who'd tasted chocolate in the midst of war's cruelty would grow up remembering that even the enemy could be kind. Maybe that was the only story that mattered. Maybe it always has been.